Guten Tag. Ich freue mich, dass Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind. Ich hoffe, Sie werden nicht erschrocken werden, wenn ich meinen Vortrag auf Englisch abhalten würde. Ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to be able to introduce to you a legendary piece of music written exactly 200 years ago. The 32nd Piano Sonata, Opus 111, by Ludwig van Beethoven. More than any other works of his, is this piece still surrounded by an aura of mystery. The sonata begins with a stormy first movement. This is followed by a more than twice as long and slow second movement, after which Beethoven suddenly breaks off. Instead of a lively finale that the genre convention of instrumental sonata presupposes, we hear silence. Although this is not Beethoven's only two-movement sonata, this is the only one that ends with a slow movement. Furthermore, after having written the Opus 111, Beethoven continued to compose actively in other genres for the remaining 5 years of his life, but he never again wrote any other sonata, be that for piano, cello, or violin. On many listeners, this sonata makes an impression that here Beethoven seemed to have found an answer to some long-standing questions, or perhaps revealed a mystery that had troubled him for many years. In the last 200 years, thousands of pages of musicological research have been written about this sonata. Dozens of radio and television programs have been broadcast in various languages. And the Opus 111 even appears in works of fictional literature. For example, in Thomas Mann's novel Dr. Faustus. In what follows, I'll try to show briefly some outstanding features that make this piece extraordinary and unique within Beethoven's oeuvre. From the viewpoint of composing technique, the 32nd sonata represents the climax of Beethoven's consistent efforts to achieve maximum effect with minimal means of expression, using a common core to create multiple contrasting moods. The first movement opens with a sumptuous introduction. At the beginning, in the bass, we have a F sharp, and in the higher voice, there are three notes: E flat, C, and B, or H in German. If I play these notes alone, without all those lavish harmonies, they sound poignant because there is a descending minor third interval, and then the small second, the smallest interval possible on the piano. Later on, in the main subject, we see the very same motive in a very different setting. Now, the notes are bare from any harmonies. They appear not in treble, but in bass, and their order is changed. Instead of E flat, C, and B, we hear C, E flat, like this. Instead of an F sharp in the bass, which was in the introduction, we hear the G in the bass as an upbeat. The last two notes comprise an interval of diminished fourth, which in such a low register sounds very harsh, deliberately. Now look at the second subject. entirely new. It signifies a drastic change of mood, but it is made of the same material as the beginning and as the first subject. E, C, and B. Basically, it's the same motif as the introduction. It even has a similar rhythm. Only with a major third instead of a minor third. So this is a major third, this is a minor third. And with E instead of E flat. Even the upper G is not new. It has been already seen or heard in the main subject, on the upbeat. The second movement is written in a form of variations on just one subject. The same four notes as in the second subject of the first movement. Moreover, the notes go this time not only downwards, but also upwards. Beethoven is often referred to as the third Viennese classicist, after Haydn and Mozart. The structure of the first movement, divided into exposition, the development, and the recapitulation, based on a contrast between the two main subjects, exhibits a strict sonata form, characteristic for the classical style. And yet, the first movement evokes many features characteristic for the preceding historical era, called the Baroque. The first subject also has a Baroque character, reminiscent of some fugues by Johann Sebastian Bach, like the one in A minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier. So here's the first subject of Beethoven, here's Bach. The sonata resemble dramatic virtuoso pieces for the pipe organ. Baroque composers such as Bach made very effective use of the organ's ability to send the air from only one key into many pipes. So if I press, for example, just one key of A, on the organ you may hear it in 4 or even more octaves. So, for instance, the famous toccata and fugue in D minor, which sounds on the organ like this, is played only with a couple of fingers. So the organist plays here and you here. But there are tricks to imitate such sound on the grand piano, and there are plenty of examples in the first movement of the Opus 111. Just to give you a brief example. The contrast between the two movements is so striking that it's tempting to see some emblematic symbolism in it. Some see there the symbols of the masculine and feminine principles. Some see a dichotomy between the worldly and the beyond. Others, an opposition of resistance and resignation, or even samsara and nirvana. I dare to propose yet another opposition between the Baroque and the Romanticism. While the first movement is oriented into the past, the second one is oriented into the future. Ernst Theodor Amadeus Hoffmann famously said, and now quote in German, alle erleichtert, so öffnet uns auch Beethovens Instrumentalmusik das Reich des Ungeheuren und Unermesslichen. Sein Reich ist nicht von dieser Welt. Beethovens Musik bewegt die Hebel der Furcht, des Schauers, des Entsetzens, des Schmerzes und erweckt eben jene unendliche Sehnsucht, welche das Wesen der Romantik ist. Er ist daher ein rein romantischer Komponist. And yet these words were said about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, composed a dozen years before the Opus 111. There, Beethoven remained with one foot still firmly in the world of classical culture. The musical form of the Fifth Symphony reflects the worldview that values logic and knows the world by dividing it into precise, straightforward, and solid categories and sections. By contrast, Friedrich Schlegel formulated the tenets of Romanticism as ein dunkles Vorgefühl eines unbekannten Gegenstandes, das Streben in eine unermessliche dunkle Ferne. Likewise, a 19th century physiologist and painter Carl Gustav Carus, a disciple of Caspar David Friedrich, wrote in his diary, "The essential feature of the Romantic will always remain the lack of closure and anticipation of what lies beyond." The favorite image of both Romantic painters and poets was the vanishing horizon. In their landscapes, painted with a brush or created with words, they love to depict endless roads or unattainable, ever-receding distances. For Novalis, the quintessence of Romantic movement was a Ruf in die Ferne. So wird alles in der Entfernung Poesie. Ferne Berge, ferne Menschen, ferne Begebenheiten und so weiter. Alles wird romantisch. Another beloved topos of Romantic artists was soaring and flying in the heights. As for music, it is no coincidence that simultaneously with the ascent of Romanticism, the popularity of the grand piano was spreading rapidly. For its chief advantage over the harpsichord is the sustaining pedal, which allows the sound to float through space and create a sort of sonorous fog. The pedal gives life to the overtones. Creates an illusion of airspace, and finally that infinity to which the Romanticists' minds was attuned. The poetry of ever-increasing distance and the overtone space pedal nature of Romantic piano became almost synonyms. As a pianist, Beethoven was famous, or rather infamous, for employing the sustaining pedal generously and abundantly, which contradicted the prevailing aesthetics of that time that demanded clarity and precision. In his later works for piano, he often used sounds in the lowest and highest register, creating a kinesthetic effect of a vast space. Here is the climax point of the Ariete movement from the Opus 11 and 111. place evokes an impression of floating above an abyss or an ocean. The perpetually jingling trill at the end produces an acoustic equivalent of a vanishing point, so much loved by Romantic painters. Between the Weimar Classic and Romanticism was a feature he shared with the poet Friedrich Hölderlin. The two were born in the same year, 1770. Though they were never acquainted personally, their mutual 250th anniversary 2 years ago gave occasion for their juxtaposition. Like Hölderlin, Beethoven in his youth was an ardent supporter of the French Revolution and its chief commander, Napoleon Bonaparte. Accordingly, with the new ideals of the end of the 18th century, both artists wanted their work to exercise a political and social impact. Parallel to that, they were involved in the movement of German idealism and studied intensively the writings of Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Schiller, as those two were still alive. Another crucial common feature was their isolation, though it had very different reasons. In the case of Beethoven, it was his deafness. In the case of Hölderlin, it was his mental disorder. In isolation and solitude, they wrote enigmatic masterpieces that perplexed their contemporaries and fascinated and mesmerized their subsequent fans and admirers. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor in December 1804, Beethoven was so sorely disappointed. For him, Napoleon's self-coronation was a betrayal of the ideals of the revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. No wonder that the final defeat of Napoleon in 1814 made Beethoven happy. But the ensuing restoration of the Ancien Régime, violently enforced at the Congress of Vienna 1 year later, turned out to be a much more severe blow than Napoleon's betrayal. An era began that many of the rebels who had previously been inspired by revolutionary ideals found extremely oppressive. Metternich's regime in Austria was convinced that the representatives of the third estate, that is, the bourgeoisie, should behave neither liberally nor conservatively, but in a purely apolitical manner. The result of these measures was the culture of Biedermeier, the epitome of stylized harmlessness and sweetness, whose ideological background intention was to create the impression of a well-protected atmosphere, Gemütlichkeit. Beethoven knew very well that behind the Biedermeier sweetness lurked a ruthless machinery of repression that ensured that any rebellious artist who did not have prestige he had himself was immediately expelled from the country or even arrested. Nonetheless, there are some tributes to the Biedermeier style in Beethoven's late works, like his 33 variations on a waltz by Diabelli. Contemplative and introverted atmosphere of many of his late works is associated with his retreat from the disappointing reality and his flee into an inner emigration. Indeed, there are some reasons to interpret the first movement of the Opus 111 as a failed rebellion. On the one hand, its overall stormy character evokes Beethoven's typically rebellious spirit. On the other hand, in the introduction, the furious outbursts constantly interchanged with timidness and passages that are holding back. The first subject that sounds so assertive at the beginning, only after a short while, is repeated in the upper register where it sounds vulnerable and even helpless. In fact, the whole first movement consists of many impetuous upswings that come to nothing. Compare this to the very beginning. One gets an impression that none of the goals toward which the music is heading can be achieved. The coda is interpreted as a call for retreat, going into a kind of inner emigration, a resignation from the world of suffering. Has an overall farewell atmosphere. Its final part evokes associations with an ascension of a spirit who is blessing those he leaves on the earth. And yet, this impression is contradicted by unambiguously insisting melodic inflections, different phrases, and with the same element, G notes on the upbeat and on the downbeat. Arguments are given to justify the same point. Thus, the second movement regains the persistence and a strong will that paradoxically constitutes a perfect harmony with the overall detachment for the worldly hustle and bustle. Now that's enough talk, it's time to get down to business and play the whole work.